Hello, everyone, and welcome to another LoLa podcast episode. Today, we have with us Kevin Shaw, who is a veteran colorist with over 4 decades of experience across broadcast, cinema, streaming, and modern digital workflows. So he began his journey in the 1980s, transferring film to video from television, and has evolved alongside the industry ever since. Now, he's currently head of color at Mission Digital, but he's also co-founder and president of the Colorist Society, alongside with a lot of other stuff that he's working on, like grading work and the Color Training Academy. And he also mentioned briefly a bit of work that he's doing over in China, and that for some reason China is interesting. Well, we'll find out all about it. Hello, Kevin. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well, thank you.
So give us a bit of an insight on what got you into the colorist work in the first place. Like, what was it?
Well, of course, in those days, nobody had ever heard of color grading. And so I fell into it by accident, as did most people. I had a strange sort of start to life. I started out as an insurance broker at Lloyd's in London, and that didn't really suit me very much. And I got off and I thought, well, I'll go back and do a foundation in art. That was my kind of interest. And from there, I got into photography. I did a degree in photography, film and television. And then, of course, you go looking for a job. I was in my late 20s by that time. So I went looking for a job and ended up as a runner in a facility in London, moving picture company. And that was where
What is a runner?
A runner is basically a very low-paid person that does anything that nobody else wants to do. So that would be a lot of it was quite a difficult job because you had to have your own car. We had to deliver tapes to broadcast stations and things. Before they could get transmitted. In those days, there was no internet or nothing could be moved except physically. So we were delivering tapes, we would be, painting offices, we would be getting props, doing shopping for shoots, all sorts of things. And this particular facility, Moving Picture Company, as I say, was privately owned, and they had studios, they had edit facilities. They had some sort of early visual effects type machines, and they had color. They had these telecine machines that transferred from film, which everybody was shooting on in those days, to television, to video, so that they could be used specifically for television. So it's a very narrow market. It was only things that were shot for television distribution. And everybody said there's no future in it, and why do you want to do this? But it sort of fitted in with my photography background. It was basically a darkroom without getting your hands stuck in chemicals, so that was a good thing. I felt I had a passion for it, and the icing on the cake was that when I spoke to the editors, and I said, what's the trajectory for editing? Oh, you'll be an assistant for 5 years, then you might get some sort of low-end jobs, and after 10 years, you'll be a decent editor. When I spoke to the colorists, they were like, well, you kind of get your head around the technology and stuff, and then after 3 months, we'll let you do some transfers, and then after 6 months to a year, you'll be a colorist. I thought, well, life seemed so short. I thought that fits into my agenda as well. And that was it. I just loved it. I got a reputation. I did about 3 years. So after being a runner, I got a job as an assistant colorist. And within 3 months, I was grading music videos. And for about 3 years, I was doing music videos, 2 or 3 a day. I'm like really just having a lot of fun. And the great thing about music videos was it was just, there's no rules. You get in there and you've got to do something different every time. And that's how I got started.
Okay, that's really interesting, because usually when we got the guests on the show, we usually have people that come in and they're talking about their experience, and it's over a period of 10 years. You're talking about 40 years worth of experience now. And when you think back, you're saying you're a colorist, and you're saying that you do color grading, and that is the focus of what you do. But in terms of the format that the videos were back then when you were starting off, so you're talking about film and you're talking about going to the TV format, but that's long before digital. We're still talking analog there, aren't we? And then from there, it goes into digital in the early 2000s. How does that change your work? And then from there onwards, how did it evolve over time? What did it look like?
Well, there was a lot of big changes, like real shakeups to the industry that, of course, they're like hurdles in a race. You have to get over them, and a few people will fall at each hurdle. So yes, there was going from analog to digital. There was going from, film to tape, from tape, reel to reel tape, I'm talking about, then to cassette, and then to digital. The big change was going from hardware to software. And that was an enormous change.
Was that almost like a big training in your? Yeah.
It was, and a lot of people were reluctant to change because, and I say this to people all the time. They say, well, why are the sort of older generation so reluctant to take up new technology? But here's the thing. Let's say you're an experienced colorist, and in those days, we were making a lot of money. We're making a lot more money in the 90s than we do today. But here's the thing: if you're an experienced colorist and you're making a good wage, and your clients expect something from you, you can't change out everything over the weekend, and then the client comes back and expects you to do exactly the same thing, and now you're just as good as everybody else because you've got no idea how it works, you've got no idea what you can do, you don't know what the tool set is, and so there's this resistance to making that change. But if you don't do it early enough, then there's this opportunity for the younger generation or for newer, less experienced people to overtake you, because now everything got easier, the machines got more powerful and usually cheaper. And so now there's this opportunity for a whole new structure to become better than you have been, even though you've got whatever experience it is. So I've always felt that you've got to be on the crest of the wave. And that was how I got into teaching, actually. It's like, well, how do you know that you are at the front and not at the back? And it's where you've got to see what other people are doing. And I got invited to teach. Actually, my first training mission was in Hong Kong. It was one of those kind of clandestine things where DaVinci, that was the software I was using at the time, had made a sale to Hong Kong. It was a big deal for them. There's opening up a whole new market. And the company had been told that this equipment was no good. It wasn't fit for purpose, and they wanted to send it back, and they wanted to buy something else. So they said, would you go out there and demonstrate to them that it does work, first of all, and set it up? We had to, in those days, you had to configure everything. There was nothing like bring it out the box, turn it on, and it all works. You typically had to send an engineer in to make it work out of the box. Nothing was kind of standard in those days. But they said, just go out there, show them that it works, see if you can train up a few people and try and find out what the problem is. Well, the problem was that they had employed a colorist, a non-resident colorist. So they brought somebody into the country to use this kit. But he'd never used the DaVinci before. He was actually a salesman for some other kit. And so he told them, oh, this is rubbish. You should buy this kit. And then I'll be able to do do all these things that you want to do. But he wouldn't turn up. When he heard I was coming, he didn't turn up. So I got the assistant, who spoke almost no English, frankly. But he was willing. He was obviously very keen to learn. He saw that there was an opportunity there. So I sort of managed to show him, or to ask him to show me the problems he was having, and he'd kind of sort of point to a skin tone and point to his skin and say, look, it's not the right color. And I'd sort of throw in some secondaries, and then he'd say, oh, and I can't change the sky, and I'd put a little, isolation mask over the sky, and would change that. And we spent 2 or 3 days together. Actually became a great friend, and he went on to be very successful in that market. And they were happy, and they kept it. That was my first training mission. And then more and more of those came in, and so much so, in fact, that eventually DaVinci said that we're paying you too much money for freelance training. We'd rather you become an employee and do it full time, as it were, and you get to move to Florida, and you get to meet the the developers and the engineers and things. So I did that for 5 years. And that actually was the period that changed from hardware to software.
Around what time was that?
So I was director of training from 98 to 2004. And so I oversaw the introduction of the last hardware color corrector. This is a box that cost like $750,000. And it only worked if you had a telecine or a tape machine. So you could add another $1 million to that before you even started putting it in a room and stuff. And around 2000, that was Lord of the Rings, and the sort of first really dedicated software color corrector was used on Lord of the Rings. It was called Colossus at the time, and it kind of evolved into Luster. And everybody sort of woke up because we had found it very difficult to get outside of television because of resolution, but also the controls and the grading systems that we had were designed specifically to get film to video.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the cinematographers didn't take that type of grading seriously for the cinema, because they wanted something that matched film to film.
Okay.
And this Colossus, Luster, kind of did that. And so companies like Da Vinci then had to sort of wake up and say, well, that's the future. We're either going to be with it or we're going to be out of business because it's going to take over everything. And in fact, when I left in 2004, it was because their solution was to create new hardware to run, feature film type resolutions. And I felt that they had kind of gone the wrong direction, because people didn't want specialist hardware that still cost a lot of money. And they said to me, we've always been a software company. It's just that we make our own hardware, our own accelerated hardware to run the software on. And I said, yeah, but that's not the point. That's not what this is. People are transitioning to off-the-shelf computers, albeit high-end and expensive, but off-the-shelf computers. That's a bit of a game changer. So I left Da Vinci. My idea was to go back into color grading, and my goal was to do something for cinema. I really wanted to get into cinema. That was like the big cherry that at the time. And so I got involved with another software company called Nucoda, and I worked with them at developing the tool set and kind of evolving for this new software generation. And I did get into, a couple of years later, I started grading feature films, still for film projection, interestingly. So this was for cinema, but not digital cinema, even though digital cinema was around, but it wasn't that big yet. And that's kind of typical of how I've kind of led my career. It's as I see things that I think are game changers, I've tried to get involved early. I've tried to talk to manufacturers and the early adopters. And so far, I've been pretty good at backing winners. That's really the trick, is not to back the ones that are not going to go anywhere.
Well, that really is the trick, because I've had this discussion lately with someone else, and the conversation was, how do you identify that early on that a technology or a way of working is going to stick? Because I always use the BlackBerry kind of example, because that's my industry. That's digital in terms of software digital. But then in consumer technology, they had the BlackBerry, which was the BlackBerry phone that had a keyboard and a screen. And here comes Steve Jobs saying, yeah, let's get rid of all that plastic and make it a full screen touch screen. And at the time, I've seen it somewhere, an executive came out and said, but someone high up in the technology world came out and said, well, that's never going to catch on, because business professionals need a keyboard. You can't just have a digitally projected keyboard. And how wrong was he? The technology was there. He was seeing it in front of him, and yet he wasn't able to see that will stick compared to BlackBerry. So in the same way, in your industry, how do you identify that a technology that's coming in is actually going to stick before it does? Because it might be so obvious now after the fact. What happens before the fact?
Yeah, and I'm not going to say that I can predict the future. I'm not that good. But you know, I've seen enough of these changes to figure out that there's a kind of a tipping point. There's really a tipping point, and it's really just about numbers. It's not so much about the quality or how easy it is or the cost even. It's just about numbers. So what you've got to look for is how much choice do we really have? So let me give you an example that I kind of lived through, and at that time I hadn't kind of figured this out very well, but the transition from CRT. So if you remember, a CRT was a monitor, the only type of monitor technology that we had, that basically consisted of a vacuum tube that you'd fired these sort of electrons in, and they were huge, right? Because it's basically almost a sphere. So you've got to have that in a box, and the bigger the screen, the further back it goes. These things get really deep and really heavy very quickly. And they're quite dangerous too, because they explode. You know, if you do want to be breaking one, because they implode because there's a vacuum there. But they made our standard reference pictures, and they were pretty good. By the 90s, they were pretty good. And gradually, these LCD screens came in, and they were crap. I mean, the early ones in the 90s were just rubbish. And we all hung on to our CRTs, and we were still buying CRTs. But looking back, I was literally missing the big picture, because I was looking at, well, a CRT is so much better than an LCD. Why would anybody buy an LCD? But about the same time, we started to see laptops appear.
Yeah.
Before mobile phones, but laptops came in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And they were fairly chunky, and they weren't that good. But there was no way that you could ever put a CRT on a laptop. There was no way that you could ever adapt the CRT technology to anything mobile. And as we all became more and more dependent really on these mobile computers, it was clear that flat screens had to get better, because CRTs weren't going to fit the bill. And then what I now know is that, you know, making displays is a very sort of niche market. You can't make like 3 or 4 displays. You have to make them in very large numbers, because the manufacturing process has a lot of rejects or sort of quality levels, and so you have to be making them in very big numbers. And so pretty quickly people just stopped making CRTs. And at that point, it wasn't really a choice of, well, we'd rather have a CRT, thank you very much, because the answer was, you can only buy existing stock. And there'd be a backlog of tubes that hadn't been made into televisions or hadn't been made into displays. But there was a date at that point where you knew there were going to be no more CRTs. And to be honest, it was at least 10, maybe 15 years before the flat screen technologies were as good as the CRT technologies. But that wasn't the point. You didn't have a choice of, well, I'd rather have a CRT, because you could only buy an old one, and then that became a law of diminishing returns anyway. And so we're seeing the same thing, for example, with high dynamic range. Nobody really makes standard dynamic range screens anymore. You might buy a device that doesn't support HDR, but the screen itself is going to support HDR.
Yeah.
Likewise, 4K, you know, you might not need 4K, but nobody's going to make an old SD type screen, even an HD type screen, because if you make a 4K screen, you can use it for HD. You don't have to put 4K into it. So really, that's the thing, is you're looking at, well, where are the choices? What's being made and why? And you can see then exactly how things are going to pan out.
Yeah. And sometimes it seems that it's not necessarily the driver behind the innovation or the new technology that's coming in. It's not necessarily the quality you get when it first gets introduced. You get a lot of people today having very strong opinions about electric cars. And they're saying they're not as good as internal combustion engines. And that's the argument. But that's not the point. The point is not that they're better. The point is that they provide for a better platform for a better car in the future. Now, the battery technology is not there yet. Fair enough. There's a lot of research happening in it. But what is an indicator that that will be a technology that we will be picked up is, one, that the governments of the world are pushing for it and they're funding towards it. And two, it's the amount of investment that goes in it from private companies that make these things. In terms of internal combustion engines, the R&D has, comparatively to the size of the market, is minuscule. There is always improvements to be made, but when it comes to electric cars, they're so close to traditional internal combustion, but they're actually being invested into a lot more. And that's the same thing that's happened with AI. That with AI, it's a new way of doing computing, but there is so much money being funneled into it that when people are saying, yeah, but AI is a bit stupid sometimes, isn't it? Yes. But imagine if you say sometimes today, and there is $1 trillion being invested into it annually, well, it's bound to get better in some ways, which means they will get better in terms of attracting people in it. And it takes me back to that old story about the horse manure in London and New York, where there were just so many horses around that the problem was becoming waste. The waste from the horses was stopping people from living in the centers of cities. And there were, at the time, they were discussing how can we solve this crisis by making better waste management for horses. And obviously that wasn't the point, because at the time internal combustion engines did exist, but they weren't good enough to say that you're replacing a horse which eats grass and drinks water, which you can find anywhere, and you're going to replace that with an engine that has a fuel tank with fuel that you can't get anywhere, and then it only goes for about 100 miles before it stops. And at that time you could say, well, it's never going to catch on. But here we are, 100 years later, there's not a single horse on site which is being used for the purpose that was being used back then. And suddenly that problem disappeared. So it wasn't about improving the waste management, it was about finding a different take to solve the same problem. And I'm guessing that's exactly what you're describing with the CRT displays and the new LCD displays, is that it's a different technology, at the time not as good or not as used, but suddenly over time you could see the investment going in it, and the old one just stopped being produced and the new one just became the norm.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's happening over and over again. Same with hardware to software changes. Like I say, higher resolutions, higher dynamic range. All of those things are inevitable just because of economics, really. And we don't control everything in our industry. We're dependent on things that we share with gaming and universities and all sorts of other areas.
Yes. So we talked about the past, and over time the technology, how it progressed, and a few turning points within your career. Where are you today? What is that you do? What do you focus on? What's your passion? What do you want to continue working on more of or less of in the next few years?
Well, so I've kind of diversified over the years. So I've got sort of three strings to my bow, really. One is the grading. So, it's still about storytelling. We know a whole lot more about color and the effect of color on people, and the displays are so much better as well, and the cameras are so much better. So, storytelling is still an important part of my day-to-day. Then there is training, which is sharing this knowledge, because every time we get over one of these speed bumps, there's a collection of knowledge which is in danger of getting lost. So when you have this sort of quantum shift of technology, there's an opportunity for a new generation to jumpstart. The technology is cheaper, the cost of entry is cheaper, or the whole thing is much easier, and it needed somebody that had trained for years before, but now you can just get on there and start doing it. All these types of things, which we're very, very familiar with today. And so I started when I was at Da Vinci, and then when Da Vinci shut down, we started the International Colorist Academy, and the idea was to take things that we'd learned from previous eras, if you want to call them that, and pass that on to the new generations. And so I get a kick out of that, and it means that I am talking to people that have not learned my way. So they've not learned from seeing changes in technology. They've just taken the latest technology and run with it. And very often they come up with interesting questions, like why do it that way when you can do it this way? But also they come up with new ideas, and between us there's a sort of a collaboration that is a meeting of minds and progressing the craft overall. So that's the second string. And then the third string is consulting, and that was where the China thing came in particular. So talking at a much sort of higher level to people who are really responsible for changing our industry. So what's the future of television? What's the future of content? How's it going to be seen? Is it going to be seen in the cinema? Is it going to be seen on the phone? And you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. But clearly there's a decline in cinemas. There's a much higher rate of viewing on phones, tablets, smaller devices. But I don't think anybody would argue that it's not better to see it on a bigger, more a better screen, a bigger, better screen. But there's this convenience factor, and I think that's something that we haven't really addressed, because we didn't ever have that problem in the past. It was always, filmmakers generally prefer to have it on a controlled screening environment. So cinema for them is very much, if you talk to Scorsese or Jim Cameron or any of these people, they will tell you it's supposed to be seen, in a cinema or in a particular way. And they're very, they actually curate the cinemas. They'll even send instructions to the cinemas about how it should be played back, what the volume should be, and all this sort of thing. But increasingly, that's not how people see content. And we haven't really addressed that. And that's one of the things that I've been sort of talking to people about more recently, is maybe we should do what's happened in other parts of the art world and distinguish from an original master and a copy, rather than just say, well, it's all, if you go and see Avatar, is it the same if you see it on a phone as if you see it in Dolby Vision 3D or something like that? Well, most people would say, no, it's not the same, but we haven't really distinguished between the two. And so the story, there's a little anecdote I tell about that if you have time for it.
Yes, of course.
About the Mona Lisa. So about 100 years ago, the photographic processing became so good that they could take a photograph of the Mona Lisa and reproduce it relatively cheaply so that people could have a Mona Lisa in their home, wherever they wanted. And there was this huge uproar in the art industry, because they said, well, but if you do that, then nobody will come and see the original. You're basically going to devalue the original by mass producing it. And this goes back to your sort of horse manure thing really as well, because there was no stopping it. Like they thought they had a choice, but they didn't have a choice, because once you could do it, somebody was going to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so it happened, and it got mass produced, and it was very popular. People had the Mona Lisa in their homes, and it was a good photographic copy, and it was representative of the original. What nobody foresaw was that increased the traffic to the original, didn't decrease it, because now people were aware of it and they wanted to see for themselves exactly what it's like. And if you go to the Louvre and you see it, it's usually, most people, the first time they see it, it's much smaller than they expected. They somehow think it's going to be this massive painting, but it's not. It's quite small. And until you get up close to it and see it in that environment, there are still things that you don't really appreciate. But that was the thing. It actually increased the traffic. And at that point, I would say that we have an extra stage in today's economy, which is you have reproductions, which are simply a way of selling the original. But now you also have merchandising. you have spin-offs. So now you can get the Mona Lisa on shopping bags and socks and t-shirts, and all those spin-offs are also making money. And sometimes all that extra merchandising makes more money than the original painting does. And I think that's where we are with entertainment content now as well, is that there's an original that should be seen where it's intended. I'm not saying that it's always the cinema, because there's original content that's designed, on Netflix and Amazon and Disney, that's designed for television, and there's original content on social media that's absolutely designed for mobile phones. I mean, think of TikTok. That whole idea of a portrait display instead of a landscape display, that's all to distinguish that this is original content for a mobile device, not for scene and so on. So all of this is interrelated. And so there is one original master, and everything else is a copy intended to send you back to the original. And I think that's happening in a big way right now. And that's where we're seeing what looks like a sort of a diversification in the industry. Some people are going towards mobile phones, some people are going towards cinema, and some people are going heavily towards television. There's a belief that television is the big market still, but I think we're pretty close to a tipping point where social media, I don't think anybody's really run numbers on how much money gets generated out of social media platforms.
Yeah, and then the question becomes with the availability of the technology and how low the entry point is, that content can be created so easily today. I'm not saying that it's good content, but it's easily created. So there's a big flood of creation of content, like what we're doing now. The discussion might be of some value to someone. The video itself might not be great, and that will end up on social media in some form or another. So then the question becomes, is everyone that's doing what we're doing today basically creating content equivalent to a big production? The answer is no. But how do you find the big production in this massive haystack of content that's being produced from every corner of the earth? And if you're saying that the platform to deliver it is going to be social media and the portrait phone delivery, then the question becomes, can't anyone just provide that kind of content on their phone? What does that
Absolutely. Put No, I think it's very valid, because at the end of the day, content is king, right? And so if there's something that needs to be said, particularly if you think about minority groups that don't have resources or may even have impediments to getting themselves heard, it's very important that they can have access and find a platform to share what they want to say. And so it shouldn't be that you have to have $100 million to make a statement on a screen. But that's not to say that you could make Avatar for $5 or for free on a mobile device. So there's a place for everything, and you have to kind of know where your place is, and then do the best you can within that. And of course, there's usually a sort of like I said, my goal around the sort of early 2000s, my goal was to work in cinema. I wanted to be working on cinema theatrical releases. That was the thing. And so usually you see people that might get into it at the low end, in terms of it doesn't take much equipment, it doesn't take much organizing and so on. But then they might get a taste for it. They might try to start getting better equipment, and then rising through the ranks into different markets and working sort of laterally as well.
So there is an upside to content being generated. So as long as there's motion, as long as there's interest, there's always a way to shine within that industry.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, and that's what I've seen is, I started off in a career that was literally taking a piece of film and converting it to videotape. Yes, there was a creative angle to it, but fundamentally it was a technical transfer. And that industry has now grown into not just cinema, which would be a fairly obvious thing to grow into, but this whole new thing, which didn't exist in the 80s, about social media. So the market has just exploded in terms of size.
Yeah.
And alongside that, all sorts of other changes have happened as well.
we can go on forever. Where are the dangers? What can we do to prepare ourselves for what's coming? Is it a case of just staying ahead of the curve and just looking out for what's happening around you?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, of course, I mean, from a career point of view, the thing you've got to avoid is A, being left behind, or B, going down a dead end and not being able to climb back, to the top of the curve again. So that's from a sort of professional point of view. But as an industry, I think you have to focus on what the goals of it are. Our industry particularly, our goals are not necessarily, a lot of people would disagree maybe, but our goals are not necessarily to make the most amount of money. There's an old saying in the facilities industry, if you want to make $1 million in the facilities industry, start off with 10 million. Right. Yep. So I mean, and I know that so a lot of colorists in person and across various sort of chat groups and things. I don't know anybody as a colorist that does it purely for the money. Honestly, you'd be better off being a plumber or an electrician or a carpenter or something. So you've got to figure out, first of all, why you're doing it. You have to have that sort of that passion, that spark. And you have to accept that, and then really it's just about doing what you do as best you can, and working with people that understand and value what you're doing.
That seems to be on a personal level, that as a person you need to work on something you have a passion for. And like you said, it's something you do see in academia a lot. A lot of people that have not been in the commercial world, they're always shielded from the necessity of having to work for necessity. And then because of that, they do have the environment to just let their imagination run wild and say, what if we did this? And what if we did that? Without actually having the constraints, and then going ahead and doing something, and something amazing comes out the other end, because the driver behind it was curiosity, creativity, and that gave a result with a soul because the people behind it had a passion for it. On the other hand, you've got commercial work. Sometimes you need to do things you don't enjoy because you need to put food on the table. You need to actually produce something that someone else cannot or will not do, and you get paid to do it. So there is that duality of the work that we're in.
Yeah, very much so. And there's often a conversation about should you work for free? And there's always that, well, how do you get into the industry? In the old days, when I was around, when I got started, there was really no option. You had to get a job as an assistant because the investment cost of that room was just beyond anybody's, imagination. Where nowadays, anybody, as you say, anybody can kind of get into it. And so what happens a lot is people say, oh, well, I haven't got any money, but if you do this for free, the next job will get paid, or it's going to be good on your show reel. You hear all of these things. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. You have to make your own judgment on each time you get asked. But what I do say to people is a professional is somebody who makes their living, who does put bread on the table, doing that job. As long as you're working for free, in my mind, that's not a professional. And in my experience, all the people that get jobs done for free, they never come back with a, huge budget the next time round.
Yeah.
Because they're in that I don't have any money market, and they need to get out of that. And you need to, funding something is an important part of what we do.
Yes. It's not just you're working today for the sake of the work that you're doing today. It does put you in a better position for the work you need to continue doing afterwards.
Yeah, and there is, that was why we started the Colorist Society, for example, because it got to the point where producers were taking the freebie work and not valuing the difference between somebody who's never done it before and somebody that's done it for quite a long time, and not understanding that actually, somebody that's costing 1/10 of the cost of the professional might still work out more expensive. Yeah. Because it might take 3 months instead of 3 days. or you may have made expensive mistakes and now you've got to go back and reshoot, or you've got to re-edit, or you've got a legal action about the soundtrack that you've created. So it was kind of saying to people, a professional has addressed all of these things. There's a place for new people, and there's definitely a place for working to a budget. But don't equate one with the other. They're not the same. That's a whole different thing.
Definitely. I would like to keep this conversation going, but we're already on the top level of the lengths of interviews that I've done. We should arrange another one, and in the next one we'll put another very specific title, and then we'll go in depth, because I really want to go into this discussion of how can you identify the technology that's going to catch, because that eludes me. I have no answer for it. It's almost like you need to do a proper deep dive into a research type work to figure out the elements, the factors that actually can indicate one or the other. We'll come back to it. So I have a lot of ideas on that. But yeah, right. It's a very interesting topic that needs to be explored. Amazing. Thank you very much for your time today, Kevin.
You're welcome.